Hey guys, welcome back to Warpaint Off-Road. Today's video, it's gonna be a little bit different. Normally, we're building crazy off-road stuff and we're doing some fun off-road things and welding and all that kind of stuff, but not today. We're gonna dive into the motor here in our project CJ. You guys are gonna learn how to identify the 350 small block that you might have in your projects, but we're also gonna learn how to test that motor to determine whether it's healthy or not when it's not in running condition. So anyway, let's dive on in, let's check it out. This engine is a small block Chevy 350. It's a carbureted motor. It's a 5.7 liter. It is super popular to swap into these, and even in the hot rod world, there are just so many small block Chevy 350s out there. The parts are cheap. They made pretty good power sometimes. The nice thing about this being a carbureted motor is there's no computer to control it. So they're pretty easy to work on and diagnose and that kind of stuff. But like I said a second ago, they didn't always make great horsepower. Some of them were made for pickup trucks and things that just weren't performance vehicles, and they may have only made 150 horsepower, which by today's standards is pretty terrible considering 4 cylinders make more. So when you have a V8 or you go to a junkyard and you find a V8, you want to put something like this in your hot rod or in your Jeep to go out and have some fun, you kind of want to know what you're looking at. And you can do that by researching the casting numbers on the motor and using the internet. So you want to start on the driver's side of the motor, okay? The driver's side cylinder head right here, I don't have a valve cover on this one, but if you go to the back side of the motor, now this one's a little bit harder to see because the motor is actually in the vehicle, but if you look down there, underneath that bolt there on the back of the cylinder head, that there's a casting number, and this one's gonna be 3970010. That 0010 is a good casting number. If you combine that with another stamp behind the timing cover on the front of the motor where you also have a 010, it usually means that it's a high nickel content casting, which makes it a little bit stronger. But we're also now going to go over and take a look at the casting number on the front of the motor, because those two casting numbers are going to give us a whole mess of information and let us know more or less what 350 this was and what its horsepower rating might be. Now again, over here on the passenger side of the motor, there's your cylinder head, right? No valve cover. We're gonna look on the front of the motor this time. So this one's a little bit easier to see, usually. This motor happens to have the alternator mounted up high with a bracket up here. Sometimes these alternators are mounted a little bit further down, makes it a little bit easier. But on the front of the motor over here, kind of deep down in there, gonna be able to see a casting number in there. And I don't know if you can really see it all that well on this video, but there's one with small numbers on the left, and then there's one with larger stamped numbers on the right, which usually starts with like a letter, some numbers, and then more letters. The casting number on the front of this block told me what vehicle this may have come from, and it told me what year, month, and what plant this motor was actually made in. But that only tells us about the bottom end, right? The crank, the pistons, the connecting rods, things like that, assuming that they're still factory. And this motor apparently could have either made 300 horsepower and 380 pound-feet of torque, or as little as 160 horsepower. So we're gonna dive on in a little bit farther and check it out, because that's a pretty big difference. And again, we would hope that it'd be the 300 horsepower version. Now, it's not a telltale sign that you have a factory original motor, but you're gonna wanna look at your cylinder heads and hope that they're factory, okay? Because the factory head would determine whether you had a higher performing motor or a lower performing motor. But even that, sometimes people change them, swap meets, things like that. So it still doesn't tell you everything, and we're gonna have to dive a little bit deeper. But the next step is to look at the head casting number. Now, the casting number on this cylinder head is basically printed right there between the valves. Of course, it's upside down and backwards, so it's a little bit hard to read, but my heads and this motor are actually going to be 487X. Now, those 487X heads are pretty rare. 487 heads are extremely, you know, they're great casting, and they're out there, they're available, they're pretty common. The 487X, the X is what makes these rare. The X meant that this was basically a slightly higher performing head. But knowing that I have the block I have, and knowing that I have the head I have, there's a pretty good chance that this motor is the way it came from the factory, and that it's the higher performing of the two. But there's one last thing that you need to look at in order to determine that, and that is the top of your pistons. Now, in order to look at the top of your pistons, you're gonna have to pull a spark plug if your heads are still on the motor. Now, using what's called a Borescope, it doesn't give a great camera view, but I'm gonna throw the piston on the screen here in just a second. The Borescope will basically allow you to stick a wire through the end of that spark plug hole and look at your combustion chamber showing the top of your piston. Now, you can get Borescopes from places like Harbor Freight for pretty cheap. You can order them on Amazon and on the internet, but you can also rent them from a lot of tool rental places, part stores, things like that. If you want a higher performing motor, you want a piston that has a completely flat surface at the top. Might have a couple of relief cuts in it for valves, but you want basically a flat top piston. And in this year engine, they made two kinds. They made one with a flat top, and they made one with a dish top. Now, the dish top has basically an indentation in the top of it. That was a lower performing piston, because when the piston goes up inside the cylinder and compresses all that air and gas in the combustion chamber, there's more space, right? And if there's more space, there's less pressure, lower compression. A flat top piston takes some of that space out of that combustion chamber when that piston goes all the way to the top, which raises your compression, which makes more power. So this engine did in fact have those flat top pistons, which means this is definitely the crown jewel of small block Chevys from the late 60s, early 70s. Now, I'm going to give you guys a quick history lesson. It'll be super fast about why I think this is the crown jewel motor. Motors back in the 60s and 70s, that was basically the horsepower wars of the time. They didn't have emissions on them yet. That's what really choked them down. Insurance companies were starting to get involved because motors were making so much power, and they were on cars that had terrible brakes and they didn't handle well, and people were starting to get hurt. Kind of like today. People aren't necessarily getting hurt, but until all these electric cars started coming out, everybody was you know, the Ford and Dodge with their SRTs and their Mustangs were going crazy with horsepower, and everybody was trying to edge everybody else out. Well, the same thing was happening back when this motor was made. It got to the point where they were actually underrating motors. So Chevy would advertise this motor in a Corvette particularly, and they would say it made 300 horsepower and 380 pound-feet of torque for insurance purposes. But good examples of factory motors back then that wound up getting dynoed, actually it was very common for them to produce even more horsepower than that directly off the showroom floor. So I don't know how true it is, but there's a lot of theories out there about how they basically lied about it just to appease the insurance companies. But kind of crazy that that's the motor that wound up in a 1978 CJ5. And this is why that's rare. The high performance motors of the time back then were put in Camaros, Corvettes, things like that, and people drag raced them. People drove the heck out of them, and they made a lot of power, but they blew them up, right? They went to swap meets, they further modified them to make them even faster and have even more power, similar to what people do today. So it's very rare to find a 53-year-old motor that's complete, that still has the original factory high performance rare cylinder head on it, on a bottom end with the great casting number, but probably the high nickel block. It's certainly going to be a 4-bolt main at this point, and with flat top pistons. That is just super rare. Now, your valve cover is pretty easy to pull off on this Chevy small block. It's just 4 bolts. You can see the bolt holes down there. There's one at the top, and then there's 2 more in the back. Now, this motor, if you look, motor oils back then weren't the greatest. So there's a little bit of sludge and gunk in this cylinder head, but not enough to stop it from flowing oil, and really not bad for something that's 53 years old. Now, the valves in this, right, this motor had 2 valves per cylinder. So this would be cylinder 2, cylinder 4, cylinder 6, cylinder 8. And we had an intake and an exhaust valve on each side. Now, this head seems to be in pretty good shape, right? These rockers can be a little bit loose, but again, that's normal depending upon where the valves are open or closed. If there's pressure on it, and there's no oil in the lifters, which puts the pressure on these rockers. So even though some of them are maybe a little bit loose, it's not terrible. Now, it's pretty inexpensive if your head looks like this. There's a good chance that this head has probably never been redone, or if it was a long time ago. So to pull your heads off, bring them to a machine shop, new valve seals, seats, things like that. It's not overly expensive. It probably won't even cost you 500 bucks, and you'll have a freshened up head. If yours looks like this, you're in good shape. But when you're done with that, you want to pull the spark plugs. You want to take a look at those. The spark plugs in this motor, they're oil fouled. They are covered in oil, which means that either the heads are leaking pretty badly or the piston rings are leaking pretty badly. So my next step is going to be to compression test this engine. Now, you're also going to want to make sure that the engine isn't frozen before you do that. You can do that by putting a torque wrench or a long socket wrench on the bolt there on your harmonic balancer and actually rotating the engine clockwise. If the engine is able to fully rotate nice and freely, you're probably in pretty good shape. If it rotates to the point where it clunks and it just stops, well, that could mean a number of things, and you're going to want to figure out what that problem is before you dive any farther. Now, again, there's lots of YouTube videos out there explaining all of these particular issues. I'm not going to do it here to keep this video not super long and not super boring, but that would be the next step. Then a good idea would be, if all that other stuff checks out, to compression test your motor. Again, I'm not going to show you how to do it. There's videos out there on YouTube and the internet. And compression tests are supposed to be done on warm engines. Obviously, even though it's 1,000 degrees in Texas, I can't heat this engine up to operating temperature. So I'm not going to get great compression readings. I know that off the start. But what I am hoping to get is consistent pressure readings across all the cylinders. Because it's cold, they typically say that all your compression numbers should be within 10%. I'm going to tighten that up. I want them probably between 6 or 7%, just to make sure that they're all wearing evenly. If I have 1 or 2 pistons that are way different than the rest of them, then I know immediately that my bottom end needs to be redone. But if that compression test checks out, your next step would be to remove the cylinder heads. It's pretty simple. And then you can actually take a look at the bores. Make sure that at the cylinders, make sure that the top of that cylinder doesn't have a lip or an edge that would maybe catch your fingernail. Make sure that they look good. Make sure there's no rust, things like that. And if all that checks out and your pistons look healthy and everything, your bottom end is probably good. You could still have a bad bearing in the bottom end, and you're really not going to know that until you get the thing up to operating temperature and run it. But at that point, spending that less than 500 bucks, refreshing your cylinder heads, throwing it back together and getting this thing running, I would start there. I wouldn't start by pulling this motor out and going and having it rebuilt right away if all that stuff checks out, right? But anyway, guys, that's how basically you research your small block 350. That's how you can kind of check to kind of have a pretty decent idea of what you're working with. There are a number of other methods out there, but these are simple. It's easy. Doesn't take a ton of time, and you can kind of have a decent idea on the health of your motor and the kind of horsepower that it makes. I really appreciate the support. I'm going to dive into this motor and actually compression test it, see what my numbers are so that I know whether I have to have this bottom end rebuilt or it's just a cylinder head issue. We're going to move on from there. Stick around. Make sure you watch this build because we're going to put some crazy axles and suspension under it, get this thing going really well out there on the rocks, and I'm doing it with my kids. So stick around, check it out.